some of the statistics that you had in this book were, I mean, they shouldn't be shocking to me, but that an individual landlord, according to U.S. Census data, spends less than 4 hours a month maintaining a property, and the average revenue is over $25K a month. $25K a month.
Yeah. I mean, I think that really shows us, when we've built an economy around growing wealth through asset inflation such that just owning a house makes more money than working. And, we had the former Los Angeles mayor, Eric Garcetti, say, in a good economy, homelessness goes up, right? That this is not none of these statistics should be surprising to us, but in many ways, this is what happens when we've, handed over our power, handed over the power to organize the places where human beings can make their lives, and I think it's really also important to say, why do our landlords own our housing in the first place, right? Yeah. They don't work harder than us. They own our housing because they have more money than us, or their parents had more money than us. And they hoard the places where human beings can live and then charge us to access it, right? That is a tribute. This is a relationship of this is a relationship of tribute. We're being held at ransom by the forms of criminalization to force us into this power relationship. We have to pay this tribute. And this is the trap that tenants are stuck in. And this is really the intervention that we're trying to make, right? To think about what is the power that we have as tenants to reverse this power relationship, to start now in our buildings and to grow that power so that we can displace our landlords and real estate industry long term.
And could you speak to the roots of that industry and how far back it goes, really, even to the Hoover administration, and just the privileging of home ownership and how that affects our economy?
Yeah. I mean, I think that we could take it even further back, right? One of the first American inventions is eviction, right? That the settlement of the United States comes with this new tool of eviction, that land was used as land was being financialized, being leveraged in this way. And so this new tool of eviction is essential to settlement, to recruiting white settlers into alignment with the state, right? And we see that process over and over and over again, right? When, as you described, right, home ownership and this idea of citizenship being completely tethered together, being completely tethered together, and
that's who could vote at the beginning of our democracy, even.
Of course, and are the systems of democracy that we have exist to basically protect the property from the propertyless. That's how our large districts were designed. We see it again in the GI Bill, right? Where what we call white flight is actually white people chasing government subsidies, where they get the benefits of these assets at the expense of people who are abandoned, right? And so this long home ownership and the supposed democratization of home ownership is this long-term strategy by which, people are recruited into alignment with elite interests, and the poor and working class, predominantly people of color, are abandoned. And I think that, what we're seeing now, right, as fewer and fewer people can buy houses, as more and more people are tenants, we're seeing a generalization of this long-term crisis, of a long-term war on tenants, right? And so when we talk about the housing crisis, in many ways, we're talking about not only this recent experience, but over 100 years of abandonment.
And it's amazing that it almost took this long to, I mean, it's still horrific. We can go back to the tenement housing right here in New York City. But I remember just looking at, when I'm a teenager, I forget, it was some high school class about how to budget or something like that. And it was no more than a third of your income should be put into rent. And that sounds, that's laughable to me at this moment. And some of the statistics that you put in there, it's just like, oh, that's basically half of renters now have crossed that 1/3 threshold. And the percentage of people that are spending half of their money on rent, which is entirely unsustainable, that's increasing as well.
I mean, yeah, there are 900,000 people there are almost like 1 million people in Los Angeles who spend 90% of their income on rent, right? 90% of your income. And like, I think what we're recognizing, right, is like, when we say market rate, what do we mean? We mean, what are the lengths human beings are willing to go to put a roof over their heads, right? And when landlords control this basic human need, right? When they hoard the spaces we can live, where they charge us this tribute to access it, right? Like, we make incredible amount of sacrifices to be able to do that, right? This is also why we describe in our book rent as a fine for having a human need. And I think that it's on the basis of, so I think that it's really important that when we talk about market rate housing, what we're really describing is the lengths that human beings are willing to go to meet their basic human needs.
Yeah, right. Noel from San Francisco said, here in San Francisco, renters want your gross monthly income to be 2 times or 3 times the asking rent. 2 times is low. In New York City, I 3 times is basically what I've seen. But and it helps if you're living with somebody. But if you're on your own, it's incredibly difficult. So I guess in terms of organizing, what are, as an organizer, what are some of the tactics that you recommend to folks who might be interested in this in their own building and want to get started?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of the things that we're describing, most of the book is really devoted to organizing strategies. And I think that, what that looks like for us is thinking about, what do we have as tenants that we can use, right? Like, what do we have? We have our bodies, we have our rent checks, and we have our relationships to each other, right? And so when we organize, we set those tools to work. That is the point of our organizing, right? So whether that's staying put in your housing, right? Like, if you are in your housing, like, despite getting an eviction notice, right? Like, you can stay put in your housing and not self-evict. You can organize with your neighbors. You can stall the legal process. There's so many things that you can do in that moment, right? When we think about our rent checks, right? Like, that tribute that we're paying every month, like, when we put it together in combination with our neighbors and withhold it, that is an incredible source of economic sanction that we can use to make our landlords like give us the thing that we're paying for, right? Whether that's fixing our conditions. We describe a building in Boyle Heights, the Mariachi Tenants Association, who organized in a market rate building, went on rent strike for a year, brought their landlord to the bargaining table to sign a collective bargaining agreement that is the equivalent of rent control for their building, right? And so I think that our rent checks can be an incredible source of power for us.
Yes.
Just like staying put in our housing and refusing to leave can be an incredible source of power. And the thing that brings those two together, right, is like getting to know each other, is our relationships to each other, right? And that is really the thing that we're relying on in the long term, right? This is movement math. There are more of us than there are of them, but in order to use the power that we have together, we need to organize. And so I think that when people want to get started in this movement, they need to look to the people around them, people who are their neighbors, people who share their landlord, people who share their blocks. These are the people that we have to rely on to build these networks of community defense and make those defensive networks into offensive ones.
Right. Garrett from Nova writes in, how can those of us who are not renting help? That's an interesting question. Yeah.
I think that's a great question. I mean, the Los Angeles Tenant Union, for instance, has we let members in that own their homes. They just can't vote. And so I think that there's actually an incredible amount that you can do, when we think about, especially, right, like one of the purposes of that, like of our homeownership system is to split working class coalitions, right? But we know from 2008, right, that owning your home is actually not a guarantee of that right. And, sometimes in the movement, we talk about bank tenants, right? Because what people who have a mortgage, effectively, the bank owns their housing. They have what is effectively rent control, but they don't actually own that right, even though they have a lot more control. So I think that building those connections, actually recognizing the precarity of what is called owning, can be a really important tool for us in this moment.
And then obviously just solidarity with our unhoused neighbors. That's the other piece of this where before we wrap up here, Tracy, I guess that's a way to talk about some of our most vulnerable folks and how they're on the front lines of the housing crisis, and that there's a whole police state and local media in a lot of cities, but here in New York, it's so pronounced, whether it's the Post or, news channels, dedicated to demonizing those folks, really on behalf of the real estate interests and the landlord class. How's best to, when organizing as tenants, also look out for unhoused people?
I think that's really right. I mean, I think one of the reasons we describe tenants rather than renters is because we're talking about anyone who doesn't control their own housing, right? And that is a broad category that includes people who live outdoors. And I think you named it just right. Like, this attack on people who live outside is really a way to split our coalitions and to build coalitions between, working class people and the police and the real estate state, right? And so we know maybe from our side that what do, right? They make spaces safe for real estate investment, for rich people, rather than for us. But I think that, this is why in this moment, building these local infrastructures where people are actually talking to each other and getting to know each other, that is really the material that we have to fight back against this, what is, this disinformation campaign. And it's only through the process of getting to know each other, of standing up for each other, that people that I have seen in my own work, people unlearn what they thought about people who live outside, right? And people actually own up to the fact that so much of what's animating their fear, animating their anger is fear, right? That we are actually so much closer to living in the streets than we are to living in a billion-dollar mansion, right? And I think that by organizing, by reckoning with this power relationship that we're in, by naming our conditions, that is how we share, that's how we share and that's how we learn. And I think that that's really, that is the tool that we have to build tenant power and to defend the most vulnerable amongst us and also us, right, at the same time.
Absolutely. Well, really appreciate your time today. Tracy Rosenthal, the book is called Abolish Rent: How Tenants Can End the Housing Crisis. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Have a great day.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.